The last place in Dublin you would expect a national newspaper to describe as one of the worst places to live in Ireland is now home to a public square named after 7 historical figures and a regeneration project worth close to €1 billion officially completed. That place is Ballymun, and the distance between those two sentences is essentially the entire story worth telling here. For decades, Ballymun meant one thing to most people in Ireland who had never actually been there: 7 towers. Built in the 1960s as part of an ambitious national housing programme designed to solve inner-city Dublin's chronic tenement overcrowding by moving thousands of families into modern, high-rise, purpose-built flats on the northern edge of the city, close to what was then planned to become a major satellite town, complete with its own shopping centre, schools and civic amenities. Each of the 7 towers was named after one of the 7 signatories of the 1916 Proclamation of Independence, a deliberate patriotic gesture built into the concrete itself, with names like Pearse Tower and Connolly Tower rising 15 stories above a landscape that had been farmland only a few years earlier. It was, at the time, considered genuinely progressive housing policy, drawing planning delegations from other countries interested in the same high-rise solution to urban overcrowding, and initial residents in the mid-1960s reportedly moved in with real enthusiasm for what felt like a modern, upgraded way of life compared to the tenements they were leaving behind. It did not age well. Within 2 decades, chronic underinvestment in maintenance, lifts that broke and stayed broken for weeks at a time, heating systems that failed through winter, and a near total absence of the community infrastructure, shops, schools, and services that should have accompanied a development housing thousands of people, turned Ballymun into a byword for failed social housing policy nationally. The shopping centre built to serve the estate struggled for decades with underinvestment of its own, becoming almost as symbolic of the area's problems as the towers themselves. Unemployment climbed sharply through the 1980s recession that hit working-class Dublin especially hard, with youth unemployment in parts of the estate reportedly reaching levels far above the national average. Drug use, particularly through the 1980s and 1990s heroin crisis that devastated Dublin's working-class communities, embedded itself in the towers in ways that took a generation to fully address, and community activists from the area were among the loudest and most effective voices nationally in campaigning for a proper state response to that crisis. By the 1990s, Ballymun's name alone was enough to generate the kind of headline this video's title borrows from, repeatedly, for years, appearing in national newspaper surveys and vox pop pieces as shorthand for urban deprivation in a way few other Irish place names ever have. Here is where most coverage of Ballymun still stops, frozen somewhere around 1997. It should not, because what happened next is the far more interesting and far less told part of the story. Demolition of the towers began in 2004, starting with Joseph Plunkett Tower, the first of the 7 to come down in a controlled implosion that drew crowds of former residents to watch. Each tower came down one at a time over more than a decade, a process deliberately staged rather than rushed, allowing residents to be rehoused in new low-rise developments being built alongside the demolition schedule rather than displaced en masse with nowhere to go. A lesson learned in part from criticism of faster, less considered demolitions attempted elsewhere in Europe around the same period. The final tower, Pearse Tower, fell in 2015, closing out an 11-year demolition programme that itself became a quiet symbol of how differently Ireland approached failed housing the second time around, this time with far more consultation with the community actually living through the transition. Behind that demolition sat a regeneration programme with a budget close to €1 billion, one of the largest urban regeneration projects undertaken in the history of the state, run through the dedicated Ballymun Regeneration Limited Agency established specifically to oversee the transformation over its multi-decade lifespan. That figure covered new housing stock built to modern standards, replacing the towers with a mix of houses and low-rise apartments designed around the kind of community infrastructure the original 1960s scheme had almost entirely omitted. It covered a new civic centre, giving Ballymun a functioning administrative and community hub it had never really had, housing a library, council services and a swimming pool under one roof for the first time in the area's history. It covered the Axis Arts and Theatre Centre, opened as part of the Regeneration to give the area genuine cultural infrastructure rather than importing culture from elsewhere in the city. And Axis has since built a real regional reputation as a working theatre and arts venue, hosting professional touring productions and community programming rather than functioning as a token community gesture, with a full performance season running most months of the year. That programme is now officially complete, and the pipeline behind it has not stopped moving. Roughly 734 new homes remain in active development pipeline for the area, part of continuing investment rather than a one-off project closed out and forgotten. Educational investment has followed a similar trajectory, with initiatives connecting local schools to third-level access programs at nearby Dublin City University, specifically designed to raise progression rates to higher education from an area that historically sent very few students onto university, a gap that community education workers have spent years working to close through mentoring and targeted scholarship supports. And in May of 2025, Ballymun opened Seven Heroes Square, a new public square deliberately named to echo the original 7 towers and their 7 proclamation signatories, a piece of public space designed to hold that history visibly rather than bulldoze it into silence along with the concrete. Here is the part of this story that deserves real attention rather than a quick mention. Naming a new public square after the very history the towers represented is not incidental. It is a specific, considered decision to acknowledge that Ballymun's story before Regeneration was not something to be embarrassed into erasing, but something to be honoured even while the physical failures of that era were being corrected. The 7 towers failed as buildings. The 7 names attached to them and the history behind those names did not fail, and Ballymun's Regeneration planners apparently understood that distinction clearly enough to build a public square around it, complete with informational plaques explaining both the 1916 history and the story of the towers themselves, ensuring that residents born after 2015 will still know exactly what once stood there. None of this means Ballymun today is without challenges. Areas that carry decades of concentrated disadvantage do not fully reset simply because the buildings changed, and residents and community workers in the area are generally candid about the fact that social and economic challenges did not vanish the moment the last tower came down in 2015. Employment, education outcomes, and community infrastructure in parts of Ballymun still lag behind wealthier parts of Dublin, and nearly €1 billion in physical regeneration, however substantial, does not automatically close gaps that took decades of underinvestment to create. Community organisations still active in the area continue to run targeted programs around youth employment, addiction support, and education specifically because the physical transformation alone was never going to be sufficient on its own, and several of those organisations argue publicly that social investment needs to keep pace with the physical rebuild, rather than being treated as complete once the last building went up. But the physical and civic transformation is real, measurable, and largely finished, which is more than can be said for most regeneration schemes announced with similar fanfare across Ireland over the past 30 years. A civic centre that functions, an arts centre with a genuine regional audience. Hundreds of new homes built and hundreds more in the pipeline. A public square, opened within the last year, that chose to remember rather than erase the very history that once made this suburb a national punchline. Ballymun in the 1990s was shorthand for a housing policy failure, so complete it needed no further explanation. Ballymun today is closer to a case study in what a genuinely sustained, adequately funded, honestly staged regeneration effort can actually accomplish when it is not abandoned halfway through, as so many similar Irish projects historically have been. Whether it becomes the exception that proves regeneration can work, or simply a well-funded improvement still working through the deeper structural challenges underneath it, is a question this decade will answer more clearly than the last one could. If this look at how far Ballymun has actually come surprised you, please subscribe, like this video, and share it with someone who still thinks of the towers when they hear the name. Let us know in the comments if you've been